October 25th, 1944. The Philippine Sea. Flight Petty Officer Kenji Tanaka gripped the control stick of his Mitsubishi Zero, his knuckles white against the worn leather. Below him, the vast American armada spread to the horizon, a steel city floating on an impossibly blue sea. For weeks, he had prepared for this moment. He had written his last letter home, participated in the solemn sake ceremony, and tied the white hachimaki headband tightly around his forehead. He was no longer a man. He was a divine wind, a single, perfect weapon aimed at the heart of the enemy. His target was a light carrier, its deck cluttered with aircraft, a fat, slow prize. He pushed the throttle forward, the Sakai engine screaming its protest as the Zero entered its final dive. Tracers, like fiery red fingers, reached for him from the ships below, a frantic, desperate attempt to swat him from the sky. He ignored them. Fear was a luxury he had discarded weeks ago. He was a creature of pure will, his trajectory as fixed as a spear thrown by a god. The ship grew larger, its details becoming terrifyingly clear. The sailors scrambling on the deck, the gun tubs spitting flame. He was close. So close. The plan was working. The ancestors were watching. He selected the ship's elevator, the heart of the vessel, the point of impact that would guarantee a glorious fiery end for both him and the enemy. Then the sky erupted. Not in front of him, not behind him, but all around him. A black cloud of shrapnel blossomed in the empty air 50 feet from his left wing, without the telltale streak of a direct hit. The explosion was a physical blow, a hammer of pure force that slammed into his aircraft. His Zero shuddered violently, the airframe groaning as if mortally wounded. A second and third detonation followed in quick succession, impossibly close, yet still missing him. Shards of hot steel ripped through the thin aluminum skin of his fuselage and wings. His canopy shattered, the wind tearing the breath from his lungs. The world dissolved into a blur of spinning sky and sea as his controls went dead. There was no honor in this, no glorious impact, just confusion, failure, and a final shocking realization. The Americans had a weapon he could not understand. It was as if their shells were guided by spirits, a dark magic that could kill without touching. This was the brutal dawn of a new reality for the pilots of the Japanese Empire. The Kamikaze strategy, born of desperation and unwavering devotion, was meant to be the ultimate asymmetric weapon. By late 1944, Japan was losing the war of production, a war it had never been equipped to fight. American factories, safe from bombardment an ocean away, were churning out aircraft, ships, and tanks at a rate that Japanese industry could only dream of. For every veteran Japanese pilot lost, America seemed to train 10 more. For every Japanese carrier sunk, 5 more American carriers appeared on the horizon. The technological gap was widening, with new American fighters like the Hellcat and Corsair dominating the skies, easily sweeping aside the once feared Zero. Faced with this overwhelming material disadvantage, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi proposed a radical, terrifying solution. If a single pilot in a conventional attack had a small chance of hitting a warship, what if the pilot himself became the guidance system? A human-guided missile, packed with over 500 pounds of explosives, could not be diverted, could not be reasoned with, and would not turn back. It was a strategy that traded one life and one obsolete aircraft for a multi-million-dollar warship and its hundreds of crewmen. The special attack units, the Kamikaze, were formed. To the West, it was fanaticism. To the Japanese high command, it was a brutal but logical calculation. The pilots themselves were mostly young men, some barely out of their teens, steeped in the warrior code of Bushido. They were taught that death in the service of the emperor was not an end, but the purest form of existence. They were the divine wind that had saved Japan from Mongol invasions centuries before, reborn to save the homeland once again. And in the beginning, it worked with horrifying effectiveness. On that same day, October 25, 1944, a kamikaze pilot slammed his Zero into the escort carrier USS St. Lo. The carrier, racked by internal explosions, sank in less than 30 minutes, taking 143 American sailors with her. In the weeks that followed, kamikazes crashed into the decks of the carriers Franklin, Belleau Wood, and Intrepid, inflicting horrific casualties and taking the ships out of the fight for months. The psychological impact on American sailors was immense. A conventional bomber might drop its payload and leave. The kamikaze was different. It kept coming, flying through a curtain of steel, its pilot a spectre of certain death. It was a weapon that targeted not just the hull of a ship, but the morale of its crew. The US Navy found itself facing a problem for which it had no effective answer. The existing methods of anti-aircraft defense were proving tragically inadequate against these determined attackers. For decades, shooting down an enemy aircraft had been one of the most difficult challenges in warfare. The primary weapon was the time fuse shell. Gunners on the ship would use complex mechanical directors to track a target, calculating its speed, altitude, and range. This data was fed into a primitive mechanical computer that would estimate where the plane would be in a few seconds. The fuse on the anti-aircraft shell would be set to detonate at that calculated time. If every calculation was perfect, if the pilot flew in a straight line without deviation, and if the shell's flight was true, it would explode in the vicinity of the aircraft. But a tiny error in any of these variables, a gust of wind, a slight jink of the pilot's controls, a minor miscalculation by the gunnery officer, and the shell would burst in empty air hundreds of feet from its target. The other option was the contact fuse, which required a direct hit, a near impossibility against a fast-moving target in three-dimensional space. The American solution had always been volume of fire. A battleship like the USS North Carolina could fire thousands of 5-inch, 40mm, and 20mm rounds per minute, creating a terrifying wall of flak. The idea was to saturate a patch of sky with so much flying metal that the enemy pilot would, by sheer probability, fly into it. This brute force method consumed enormous quantities of ammunition. Statistics from earlier in the war were sobering. The Army estimated it took, on average, over 20,000 rounds of small-caliber ammunition and thousands of heavy-caliber shells to down a single enemy aircraft. The kamikaze exposed the fatal flaw in this strategy. A conventional pilot, seeing the sky fill with black puffs of flak and red tracers, would instinctively take evasive action, breaking off their attack run. But the kamikaze pilot had no instinct for self-preservation. He would fly straight into the storm, his only goal to reach the target. Even if his plane was riddled with bullets and shrapnel, even if he was mortally wounded, the momentum of his dive could still carry the aircraft and its bomb load into the deck of a ship. The Navy was desperate. They needed a way to guarantee a kill, to detonate a shell close enough to an aircraft to destroy it, without the impossible requirement of a direct hit or a perfectly timed fuse. They needed to increase the lethal radius of every single shell they fired. Deep in laboratories back in the United States, a team of scientists, led by a physicist named Merle Tuve at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, had been working on a top-secret solution since 1940. It was a project so sensitive that it was given the intentionally boring name VT for variable time. The device they created was a miniature marvel of engineering, a radio set no bigger than a milk bottle, rugged enough to be fired from a cannon. It was a fuse that contained a tiny radio transmitter and receiver. Fired from a 5-inch gun, the fuse would begin emitting radio waves as it flew. When those waves struck an object, like an enemy aircraft, they would bounce back to the receiver in the fuse. As the shell closed on the target, the frequency of the returning signal would change due to the Doppler effect. An internal circuit, the heart of the device, was designed to measure this change. When the reflected signal reached a specific heightened intensity, indicating the shell was just about to pass its target, it would trigger a switch, detonating the 55 pounds of high explosive in the shell. The fuse had a brain. It knew when it was close to the enemy. It didn't need a direct hit. It didn't need a timer. It just needed to get close. For the Japanese pilot, this meant the entire sky around him had become a kill zone. Every near miss was now a direct hit. The Americans, it seemed, had learned to practice magic. The birth of this magic was a triumph of desperation and ingenuity, forged in secret laboratories half a world away from the Pacific Inferno. As early as 1940, with Britain standing alone and America watching the world descend into chaos, military planners recognized the fatal weakness of conventional anti-aircraft fire. The challenge was presented to America's top scientific minds: create a fuse that could think for itself. The task fell to a team at the Applied Physics Laboratory, APL, at Johns Hopkins University, under the direction of physicist Merle Tuve. The concept they pursued was deceptively simple: put a tiny radio station inside an artillery shell. The engineering reality, however, was a nightmare. The components had to be miniaturized to an unprecedented degree, fitting into a space no larger than a pint milk bottle. But the true challenge was ruggedness. Every component had to survive the moment of firing, an event of unimaginable violence where the shell was subjected to forces exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity and spun at over 25,000 revolutions per minute. Early prototypes were readied into powder before they even left the gun barrel. The heart of the fuse was its vacuum tubes, delicate glass bulbs containing a near-perfect vacuum and fragile filaments. To the engineers, being asked to make a vacuum tube survive being fired from a cannon was like being asked to build a watch that could survive being hit with a sledgehammer. They pioneered new techniques, creating tubes without conventional filaments, their internal structures supported by wax and asphalt, every component locked in place to withstand the brutal acceleration. They had to invent a battery that was inert until the moment of firing, when the shock of acceleration would shatter a glass ampule, releasing electrolyte and bringing the device to life in a fraction of a second. The fuse had built-in safety measures, mechanisms to prevent it from arming until it was safely clear of the ship, and a self-destruct feature to ensure duds wouldn't fall into enemy hands. The project's secrecy was absolute, rivaling that of the Manhattan Project. President Roosevelt himself followed its progress. A single captured fuse could allow the Axis powers to reverse engineer the technology and, just as importantly, develop countermeasures. The fear was so great that the fuse's initial deployment came with a strict command. It was only to be used over water, where any unexploded shells would be lost forever in the ocean depths. The industrial effort required to mass-produce this device was staggering. It was a national undertaking. Companies like Crosley, RCA, Sylvania, and Eastman Kodak, who had previously made radios, refrigerators, and cameras, retooled their factories. Production lines, staffed largely by women, worked around the clock, assembling the 130 delicate components that made up each fuse. By the end of the war, over 22 million of these intricate devices would be produced. It was an industrial miracle, a secret weapon manufactured on an assembly line scale. The first blood was drawn on January 5, 1943. The light cruiser USS Helena, part of a task force near Guadalcanal, picked up an incoming Japanese Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber. The ship's 5-inch guns opened fire. The gunnery officer, accustomed to the frustrating mathematics of anti-aircraft fire, watched the black puffs of traditional time-fused shells burst harmlessly behind the target. Then, a new type of shell was loaded. The 5-inch gun barked, and the crew watched the shell race towards the valve. It didn't hit, but as it passed just below the bomber's wing, the sky was lit by a blinding flash. The valve, which a moment before had been a sleek instrument of war, simply came apart. Its wing sheared off, the fuselage cartwheeling in a plume of black smoke before plunging into the Solomon Sea. On the bridge of the Helena, there was a moment of stunned silence, followed by a chorus of jubilant cheers. They had witnessed the impossible. It wasn't a lucky shot, it was a kill achieved by proximity. From the Japanese perspective, these early encounters were inexplicable and terrifying. A pilot, focused on his attack run, would suddenly see a wingman's aircraft disintegrate for no reason. There was no direct hit, no trail of a tracer leading to the plane. One moment it was there, the next it was a ball of fire and falling debris. Surviving pilots would return to base with garbled, frantic reports. They spoke of invisible shields, or shells that seemed to be guided by an unseen force. They described explosions in empty air that were powerful enough to rip a plane in half. These reports were met with skepticism by Japanese intelligence officers. They were dismissed as combat fatigue, excuses for cowardice, or the wild exaggerations of terrified men. Without physical evidence, a shell fragment, a downed aircraft with telltale damage, a captured fuse, there was nothing to analyze. The Americans were winning, the officers concluded, because they had more planes and better pilots, not because they possessed some form of black magic. The Navy's strict over-water-only rule was the key to maintaining the secret. Throughout 1943 and much of 1944, the fuse was a phantom, an occasional terrifying anomaly that defied explanation. The Japanese military remained blissfully unaware of the technological leap that had been made. But as the American island-hopping campaign pushed closer to Japan, and the kamikaze threat emerged as a clear and present danger to the fleet's survival, the calculus of secrecy began to change. The lives of American sailors and the integrity of the Pacific Fleet were deemed more important than the risk of the secret getting out. In late 1944, as waves of special attack units began to form, the order was given. The VT fuse, now designated the Proximity Fuse Mark 32, was cleared for widespread use in the defense of the fleet. The trickle of magic shells was about to become a flood. For the young men climbing into the cockpits of their Zeros and Vals, their minds focused on a glorious death in service to the Emperor, the sky was about to become an infinitely more hostile place. The strange, isolated incidents of planes exploding without cause were about to become the horrifying norm. The anomaly was about to become a systematic slaughter, as Japanese pilots, committed to the ultimate sacrifice, flew headlong into a lethal web of radio waves and high explosives they could neither see nor comprehend. The catalyst had been introduced, and the unraveling of Japan's most desperate strategy was about to begin. The full fury of the proximity fuse was unleashed during the invasion of the Philippines. As American forces stormed the beaches of Leyte, the Japanese High Command initiated Operation Shogo, a massive naval counterattack, and with it, the first large-scale, organized kamikaze offensive. For the gunnery crews of the US Navy, this was the ultimate test. On November 27, 1944, a swarm of kamikazes descended on a task force commanded by Admiral Willis Lee. Among the ships was the battleship USS Colorado. Her gunnery officer watched as a Japanese aircraft began its dive. In the past, this moment would have been a frantic prayer, a hope that the sheer volume of 40mm and 20mm shells would be enough. But now, the 5-inch gun spoke with a new authority. A single proximity-fused shell was fired. It raced toward the diving plane and, to the astonishment of the crew on deck, detonated in a black puff of smoke about 60 feet from the target. The plane, seemingly untouched, continued its dive for a split second before its nose pitched up violently. It then tumbled end over end, completely out of control, and crashed harmlessly into the sea. The invisible cloud of shrapnel had done its work, severing the pilot's control cables as effectively as a surgeon's scalpel. The pilot was a passenger in his own guided missile, his final act of will rendered impotent by a weapon he never knew existed. This scene was repeated across the fleet with devastating consistency. The cruiser USS Montpellier shot down 5 kamikazes in a single engagement, all with proximity fuses. The destroyer USS Eaton fought off 6 separate attacks, downing 4 with her main guns. Aboard the ships, a sense of disbelief turned into fierce confidence. Gunnery reports sent back to Pearl Harbor were initially met with skepticism. The numbers were too good to be true. Before the fuse, it took an average of 500 5-inch shells to down a single aircraft. With the new fuse, that number plummeted to less than 50. The probability of a kill with a single shell had increased 100-fold. A report from a fleet commander summarized the new reality with stark clarity. The new fuses are phenomenally effective. Without our ship losses would have been much heavier. For the Japanese, the Philippines campaign was a slaughter. The pilots of the special attack units, prepared for a glorious death against the hull of an American warship, found themselves dying in empty sky, their planes torn apart by an unseen hand. The reports they sent back, if they survived long enough to transmit, were filled with confusion. They described enormous expanding bullets and walls of fire that appeared from nowhere. The psychological effect was profound. How could you fight an enemy who could kill you without even hitting you? The code of Bushido had prepared them for a warrior's death, not to be swatted from the sky by a force that bordered on the supernatural. Japanese intelligence struggled to make sense of the carnage. They analyzed the few returning aircraft that were damaged but not destroyed. They found strange shrapnel patterns, small uniform holes that suggested an explosion from the side, not the front. But the concept of a self-detonating shell seemed like science fiction. Their own scientists were decades away from such technology. The most prevalent theory was that the Americans had perfected some form of radar-guided gun laying, allowing for impossibly accurate fire. This was partially true, but it missed the revolutionary component, the fuse itself. The ultimate crucible came during the Battle of Okinawa in the spring of 1945, codenamed the Typhoon of Steel. It was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War and the apex of the kamikaze threat. The Japanese launched over 1,900 kamikaze attacks in a desperate, final effort to halt the American advance. They threw everything they had at the fleet: Zeros, Vals, even rocket-powered Oka suicide bombs. In response, the US Navy created a new defensive posture. Radar picket destroyers were stationed miles out from the main fleet, an early warning line designed to intercept the attackers. These isolated, vulnerable ships bore the brunt of the kamikaze fury, but they were armed with the magic fuse. The accounts from these picket ships are a testament to the fuse's effectiveness. The destroyer USS Laffey endured an 80-minute onslaught from 22 separate kamikazes. While she was hit multiple times, her 5-inch guns, firing proximity-fused shells, were credited with shooting down 9 of the attackers, a kill rate that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. Another destroyer, the USS Hugh W. Hadley, shot down 23 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement, a record for a single ship in one day, a feat made possible only by the fuse. On the decks of these ships, American sailors witnessed a new and terrible kind of fireworks. They watched as entire formations of Japanese planes were systematically blown from the sky. A flight of 4 Zeros would dive, and 4 black puffs of smoke would appear in sequence, each one claiming a plane. It was a methodical, almost industrial process of destruction. The Fuze had turned anti-aircraft gunnery from a game of chance into a near certainty. The statistics compiled after the battle were staggering. Naval analysts concluded that the proximity fuse was responsible for downing over 75% of the kamikazes destroyed by naval gunfire. It was, according to the Secretary of the Navy, the second most important technological development of the war after the atomic bomb. One captured Japanese pilot, when interrogated, finally gave voice to the terror his comrades had faced. He described how he had watched 3 planes in his flight, one after another, explode in mid-air without being hit. He said the American gunners seemed to be magicians who could command the spirits of the air. His own plane was damaged by one of these mysterious explosions, forcing him to ditch in the sea. The dawning horror for the Japanese High Command was not just that they were losing planes and pilots. It was that their ultimate strategy, the one born of their most sacred cultural and martial beliefs, had been rendered almost obsolete by a piece of technology they could not comprehend. The divine wind was being scattered by an electronic whisper. The spirit of the warrior was being broken by a 5-pound radio transmitter in the nose of a shell. The kamikaze pilots continued their attacks with suicidal bravery until the very last days of the war. But they flew into a sky that was now laced with an invisible, intelligent web of destruction. Their helplessness was absolute. They were ghosts, already dead, flying into a storm of steel that now had a brain. The unraveling was complete. The magic of science had triumphed over the ritual of sacrifice. The strategic equation of the Pacific War had been irrevocably altered. The proximity fuse did more than just shoot down planes. It changed the very nature of naval warfare. Before its arrival, the primary defense against air attack was distance and fighter cover. Carriers had to stay far from enemy airfields, and their combat air patrols were the first and most critical line of defense. But the fuse provided a reliable, lethal last line of defense that had never existed before. It transformed every destroyer, cruiser, and battleship into a fortress. This newfound defensive power gave American commanders an unprecedented level of tactical freedom. They could push their fleets closer to enemy shores, operate for longer periods in high-threat environments, and conduct sustained bombardment and air campaigns with a confidence that would have been suicidal just a year prior. The invasion of Okinawa, a stone's throw from mainland Japan, would have been impossible without a reliable counter to the kamikaze. The fuse, in essence, was the key that unlocked Japan's inner defenses, allowing the typhoon of steel to be unleashed. For the Japanese, the strategic impact was devastating. The kamikaze was their last trump card, the one weapon they believed could inflict such horrific losses on the American fleet that it would break their will to fight. It was a strategy designed to trade lives for time and morale. The proximity fuse shattered that calculation. While kamikazes still broke through and caused immense damage, their success rate plummeted. The fuse turned the tactic from a potential war-altering strategy into an act of mass and often futile self-sacrifice. The Japanese response was to increase the scale, sending waves of 100 or more planes at a time, hoping to saturate the American defenses. But they were trying to solve a technological problem with human bodies, an equation that could only lead to ruin. The fuse's impact was not confined to the Pacific. In Europe, it was proving to be the decisive countermeasure to another of the Axis's terror weapons, the V-1 flying bomb. Since June 1944, these buzz bombs, the world's first cruise missiles, had been raining down on London. Launched from sites in occupied France, the V-1s were fast, small, and flew at a low altitude, making them incredibly difficult targets for conventional anti-aircraft guns. For months, the defence of Britain was a desperate affair. RAF fighters tried to intercept them, sometimes by tipping them over with their own wingtips. Anti-aircraft batteries fired tens of thousands of shells for every V-1 they managed to hit. The psychological toll on the British populace was immense. Then, in the summer of 1944, Proximity fuse shells were secretly rushed to the anti-aircraft batteries lining the English coast. The results were immediate and miraculous. On the first day of their use, the kill rate against the V1s doubled. Within a week, it had tripled. By the end of August, the gunners were shooting down over 70% of all incoming V1s. The skies over the English Channel became a graveyard for Hitler's vengeance weapon. British gun crews, who had once despaired at the seemingly impossible task, now watched with grim satisfaction as the buzz bombs were systematically blown out of the sky, far from their intended targets in London. General Frederick Pyle, the commander of Britain's anti-aircraft command, called the fuse the final answer to the V1. Later, when the Germans began launching V1s against the vital Allied port of Antwerp, proximity fuses were deployed there, creating a defensive shield that saved the primary supply hub for the Allied push into Germany. General George Patton, whose Third Army was being supplied through Antwerp, would later state that the proximity fuse had played a vital role in the Allied victory in Europe, a fact often overshadowed by its more dramatic role in the Pacific. The legacy of the proximity fuse extends far beyond the Second World War. It represents a fundamental turning point in military technology, the dawn of the age of smart weapons. The fuse was, in its most basic form, a primitive guided missile system. It contained all the essential elements: a sensor to detect the target, the radio receiver; a processor to decide when to act, the trigger circuit; and a warhead. This basic principle of a weapon that could sense its environment and act autonomously became the foundation for virtually every guided missile that followed. The Sidewinder air-to-air missile, which homes in on the heat of an enemy's engine, and the Patriot surface-to-air missile, which uses sophisticated radar to intercept incoming threats, are both direct technological descendants of the humble VT fuse. The secret of its existence was so well kept that even after the war ended, its full story remained classified. Harry Truman, in his first press conference after the Japanese surrender, referred to it as a mystery weapon that had played a decisive role. It was only then that the American public and the world began to learn about the device that had been developed in quiet university laboratories and built in converted refrigerator factories. The project had been a monumental success not just in invention, but in production and secrecy. It was a testament to the power of organized science and industry harnessed for a single purpose. The fuse represented the ultimate triumph of a new way of war. It was a victory of physics over fanaticism, of radio waves over sheer will. It proved that in the industrial age, the side with the most advanced technology and the ability to produce it in overwhelming numbers would ultimately prevail. The image of the Kamikaze pilot, with his ceremonial sword and hachimaki headband, embodies a centuries-old warrior tradition, but his final moments were dictated by a weapon born of a new tradition, the scientific method. He was a symbol of the past, destroyed by a harbinger of the future. The proximity fuse didn't just win battles, it announced that the age of smart autonomous weapons had begun, changing the face of warfare forever. The story of the proximity fuse is the story of a secret whispered across an ocean, a secret that remade the sky. It began with the unwavering certainty of men like Flight Petty Officer Kenji Tanaka, who believed their will alone could turn the tide of war. They were the embodiment of a strategy that pitted the human spirit, in its most extreme form of self-sacrifice, against the cold, hard steel of the American war machine. They saw themselves as a divine wind, a spiritual force that could overcome mere material superiority. They flew with the blessings of their ancestors, having participated in sacred ceremonies, their minds clear and focused on a single, pure objective. They were convinced that their devotion, a force forged in the traditions of Bushido, would guide them to a glorious and meaningful end. But they did not fly into a battle of spirit against steel. They flew into a battle of spirit against physics. They flew into a lethal web of radio waves, an invisible, intelligent defense that made no distinction between a fanatic and a faulty engine. Their courage was immense, their devotion absolute. But they were utterly helpless against an enemy who had turned the very laws of science into a weapon. The American response to the Kamikaze was not born of warrior poetry or ancient codes. It came from university laboratories and corporate research departments. It was the product of men in lab coats wielding slide rules, of engineers debating circuit diagrams, and of women on assembly lines in places like Indiana and Ohio, meticulously soldering wires into a device they were told only was important. While Japan was sharpening the sword of its spirit, America was perfecting a system. It was a system that trusted not in the glorious death of a single hero, but in the collaborative genius of thousands of anonymous scientists and workers. It was a system that believed any problem, even one as terrifying as a suicide attacker, could be solved with enough ingenuity, resources, and industrial might. The proximity fuse was the ultimate expression of that philosophy, a weapon that delegated the impossible task of hitting a speeding plane to a tiny thinking machine. It was a solution born not of passion, but of cold, calculated, brilliant logic. The Kamikaze pilot's final moments were therefore not a clash with an American sailor looking through a gun sight. They were a fatal encounter with the Doppler effect, calculated by a circuit no bigger than a man's hand. The black clouds of shrapnel that blossomed in the empty air around them were more than just explosions. They were the punctuation marks at the end of a technological sentence the Japanese could not read. They were proof that the nature of war had fundamentally changed. The conflict was no longer just about bravery or tactics, but about which nation could harness the fundamental forces of the universe more effectively. The terror that had gripped the American fleet in late 1944, the feeling of utter helplessness as the divine wind plunged towards their decks, was transferred, amplified, and sent back into the cockpits of the Japanese pilots. They now faced the ultimate horror, not just death, but a death that was incomprehensible. A pilot would watch his wingman disintegrate, then the pilot in front of him, each vanishing in a flash of light that had no visible source. The certainty of a glorious impact was replaced by the terrifying bewilderment of an invisible, infallible executioner. The American sailor on the deck of a destroyer didn't need to be a perfect shot. He just needed to get a shell into the vicinity, and the fuse would do the rest. The confidence this gave the US Navy was immeasurable, transforming a desperate defense into a systematic extermination. The Kamikaze strategy was designed to instill terror, but it was ultimately broken by a weapon that inspired a different kind of awe, the awe of scientific achievement. In the end, the most powerful force in the Pacific was not the divine wind of Japanese tradition, but the relentless, invisible storm of American ingenuity. The warrior's spirit, forged over 1,000 years, was vanquished in a microsecond by a 5-pound radio in the nose of a shell. The Kamikaze was the last, desperate human cry of an old way of war. The proximity fuse was the quiet, confident electronic whisper of the new.